Very warm welcome to everyone. So we would now begin with our second panel discussion on the topic, Identifying and Mitigating Culture Risk in M&A. Clint C. Kendrick would be moderating the panel. Our guest speakers for this panel discussion are Elizabeth Bryant, Mark Wolsteny, Maureen Loney, Rob Garber, and Susan Hanold. So over to you, Clint.
Great. Hello, everybody. And I'm excited to be moderating this panel with such a great group of individuals. My name is Clint Kendrick, and I'm the chair of the HR M&A Roundtable. I've done a number of deals in my career, and I've learned a lot from the 5 people that we're going to be hearing from just in our brief conversations about culture. And I'm hoping that you'll take away some things that will help you with your culture journeys as you seek to drive value with your M&A work. So why don't we go ahead and start with some introductions. We'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the questions. Let's begin with Susan Hanold.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I am Susan Hanold with ADP Strategic Advisory Services team. And in my role, I help out our clients build out their HR strategy and to provide advice and insight when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. Glad to be here.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Mark?
Hi, everyone. I lead the talent and HR due diligence and integration team at Crow, which is a global accounting, tax, technology, and consulting firm. My clients are typically strategic acquirers and private equity firms in their portfolio companies. And my background initially on the HR side was as an HR executive and CHRO. And the last 15 years, I've been a coach and consultant in the due diligence and M&A area. I also love the work. I love to work with great people, and I'm looking forward to learning from this session today.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm a partner with Mercer based in our Washington, D.C. office. We have a dedicated business focused on M&A, and I lead a part of that business. In my deal work, I focus primarily on complex multi-work stream divestitures and integration.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Maureen.
Thanks, Clint. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm with Cisco Systems in the M&A practice, and have been here for about 8 years, leading dynamic teams. So we form teams around individual acquisitions, and I do that from an HR people perspective, starting in the early term sheet phase and working that through with the team all the way through the integration. I think I've done about 20 deals over those 8 years. Cisco is a serial acquirer. I think we're at 229 right now. And so just again, happy to be here and looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Maureen. And Rob.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Garber. I'm a career HR guy, HR consultant, who for the last 15 years led the HR M&A team for a serial acquirer. Not long ago, I founded my own consulting firm, the Adeptus HR M&A Advisors, where I help clients manage transactions. I've worked on a lot of deals, buy side and sell side transactions.
Great. Thanks, Rob. And we're going to jump into some questions now, but I want to invite everybody who's listening or watching to go ahead and drop any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll make sure that we address those if there's time. We have planned to have some time at the end to answer specific questions, so please don't be shy about using that chat feature. So why don't we begin by level setting? What is culture, and why is it important for M&A professionals to understand? Maureen, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. So I think a way to look at culture is we hear about values and beliefs, right? So those things might be like intangible and hard to see and to that aren't necessarily visible. So if you think about sets of systems of beliefs and values, it can be visible through the way that people behave day to day, right? And the rituals that teams have. So what environments does that create, and what is the experience employees are having within that? And I think another piece is that, sometimes the word culture can be, people have an aversion to it, or it can be thought to be like soft or fluffy. So another way to think about it is just through operating areas, right? So if we're trying to get an understanding of those beliefs and values and observe and assess behaviors, we can look at operating areas. So some examples of these could be things like, diversity, equity and inclusion, risk orientation, customer orientation, vision and strategy, of course. And then I think, as Nitin said earlier this morning, discussion isn't complete unless we talk about things related to COVID, because we're all navigating this for over a year and a half. So I think a few other areas that are important to look at with a cultural lens in terms of how a company is operating are around facilities and remote practices. So like how are companies navigating that and kind of existing today and planning for a return. And then another one that comes to mind is health and wellness, right? So including mental health. So what does a company believe related to this? What are their values? And, in this new world that we're all in, how do we look at those areas to ensure that we're retaining talent through the integration and beyond to be able to deliver on the deal value that we're setting out with to begin with. So I think that kicking that off, Clint, as a kind of a broad definition and some lenses to look at around culture.
Great, thanks, Maureen. Elizabeth, how about you? How do you think about culture and why is it important for M&A professionals to understand?
Sure, completely agree with Maureen on that, especially around this sort of the idea of it's your operating environment, meaning sort of how do things get done around here. One of the things you can look at is, what do leaders say? And then what do they do? How are decisions made? What takes priority in day-to-day behaviors? And what is rewarded? Regarding, the importance, it is, first of all, it's critically important. I think most people are coming to that common understanding as well. So Mercer has an in-depth M&A readiness research series, and in our third series, the most cited people issue derailing deal success was leadership and culture. That's pretty telling, right? So, and the research respondents are typically CEOs, COOs, CFOs, the top executive team, and of course, CHROs. One of the reasons, though, that it is so important is because it can really derail your deal objectives, deal thesis, as well as your synergy targets, as well as the timelines, to reach those. Another challenge, I think, is that with culture, it's frequently seen as less urgent than other aspects of integration. The cadence from deal announcement to signing, and then 100 days post-close, it frequently gets hyper-focused on org design and synergy realization, as well as other functional planning activities with, thinking of, we have time on culture to address that. And then it starts to bubble up in those first 100 days. So for example, on a recent integration that we were working with, the acquiring organization had a very strong culture of consensus driven decisions. And while that sounds good, in the surface, what it led to, pretty quickly during the initial integration work was a need to have meetings with upwards of 30 to 40 people to discuss and agree on a decision. And, merely scheduling a meeting like that becomes problematic very early, right? Never mind trying to get everyone informed on what the topic is and then come to an agreement. And as we dug into that further, what we really learned was it was less about consensus, which sounded good, and more about the lack of accountability of decisions. There was no one person or two people you could go to that really owned that decision. And so that became a big shift that needed to happen to enable the deal objectives to go forward on a timely basis.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. How about you, Rob, in your experience? How do you look at culture and why should we understand it?
I don't think I have anything to add to what Elizabeth and Maureen said as far as the definition of culture goes. But in my experience, I think you can actually create some competitive advantage in the deal process just by asking about culture. So I come from a background where I've worked on dozens of deals involving the acquisition of founder-led businesses. And I think the dynamic with founders, they're going into a transaction and they care about what happens to the people. I've worked on a transaction where it was my organization competing against a lot of financial buyers. And after we had won the bid, we were having a meeting with the CEO and founder of the company we bought, and heard from him that he really liked that we focused on culture and talent during due diligence, that they didn't experience that with any of the other potential suitors. And it was a differentiator for us. And I think if you think about founders, often they're surrounded by a team of people who help them build the business to the point that it was successful enough to be a takeover target. And they feel some loyalty to those folks. And by asking about the culture and by trying to understand who the people are and how they work, you kind of set yourself apart in terms of caring about the people and being looking at the deal as more than just some financials.
Great, thanks, Rob. How about you, Mark?
Thanks, Clint. I'm going to come at it in terms of two challenges. And one challenge is really, how do you compare the cultures? I see often the focus is on understanding the culture of the target company. But if there's really going to be a benchmark or an assessment of where the cultural gaps or cultural adds, as you will, it's really important to understand the acquirer's culture. So I think in looking at the acquirer's culture, there's some value in taking same approach, right? Looking at documents, artifacts, etc. But it's also, I think, their past integration experience and deal experience, and what were those behaviors. I think it was Kurt Lewin who said, if you really want to understand a culture, try to change it. And certainly these are those types of environments where the culture at rest may be different than the culture under stress. So the 2 points I would just want to reinforce is, be sure you're attending to the acquirer culture as a benchmark, and then you can do a compare and contrast and determine where the gaps are and the gaps that matter. Some matter, some don't. All depends on deal objectives. And then what's happened in the past, and that's the challenge piece. And part of that is listening. What are the tales of brave Ulysses, right? During the last integration, what went well, what didn't go well, who were the heroes, and who didn't perform up to expectations. So those are all some applications, I think, of the culture definition and why it's important for M&A professionals to understand these dimensions.
Great, thanks, Mark. And how about you, Susan?
Thank you, Clint. Good example so far. And one of the things I was thinking about is a situation I just had yesterday with a company I was talking to. And from a culture perspective, I was doing a stakeholder interview analysis, really talking to stakeholders, asking, what are their HR priorities right now? They seem to be right now, clients are having or just companies in general have a lot of different priorities. I think you just brought it up, Elizabeth and Maureen, about this COVID, right? But there's all these things that keep getting thrown up on the whiteboard right now. And what do we actually take off? But when it comes to culture, and I was helping this company align their HR, all these initiatives, the key stakeholders and business leaders said, we feel like from this acquisition we just had, we have the we versus them culture. And it really struck me when I was listening to this. I said, well, tell me more about that. And they said, well, we had this acquisition, and right now we know that there's this talent war happening. And so people are looking for a way where you can move talent. And they said, well, we're really confused because we feel like we're in silos. we have this business unit over here and we have this business unit over here, but we're not working together. Or should we be working together? And it brings up the question, and I think Clint, you posted up on LinkedIn, I guess the other day, about who owns culture. And is it the CEO? As I actually asked them, I said, well, what do you want it to be? How should it be working? How are you measuring this? I didn't have any measurements, and they basically pushed it back onto HR. And I immediately went to the CHRO when I was debriefing yesterday with the CHRO, and it almost became a finger pointing exercise. Well, who said what? Well, no. It's not about who's saying what. It was back to Mark, to your point too, is having those benchmarks, compare the two, and then where are you trying to go? And then how do you make that shift in behaviors? And what are those desired outcomes you're looking for? So, I kind of throw it back out to the group, and I'd love to hear people in the chat too. Who owns the culture? And then how are you going to measure the culture? What are some techniques for measuring that culture and reducing that after effect? They totally feel they want to grow and they want to work together. They want to have enterprise initiatives. Just right now, they're feeling like they're in silos. So that's my just kind of current example of what I'm seeing with the client with this one account.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Susan. I think that really highlights the importance of culture, right? Because culture is about how things happen in a place. It's about how decisions are made, what the company leadership feels is important, and how the people are seen and treated. And just to summarize some of the other points, asking about culture tells the seller that the buyer cares about the people, and that it's important to understand the cultures of both firms, not only for retaining key people, but generally minimizing disruption and ensuring business continuity amongst the entire workforce. So why don't we jump into the next question, which is, when should we start discussing culture? What's the right point in a deal to start talking about culture? And what are some of the trends that we're seeing in culture conversations? I know that when I started doing M&A work more years ago than I'm willing to admit in a recorded meeting, culture was not top of mind for a lot of acquirers, and that conversation has shifted and continues to evolve. So where are we seeing it evolve to? Rob, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts, Clint. First, I strongly believe that your culture due diligence, if you want to call it that, needs to start at the very beginning of the transaction. My point of view is that if you're waiting till you sign the deal to start to dig into the culture, it's too late, because you have some really important things that you're going to need to do as soon as you sign a deal, namely communicate with the employees that are becoming part of your organization. And if you don't have some understanding of how the business that you're buying functions, you're going to likely come across as tone deaf when you communicate with employees. You run the risk of just not delivering your message in a way that's going to be as effective as it could be. And I think one of the ways that you can get an early start on doing this work is by mobilizing your due diligence team and enlisting each one of the members of your due diligence team who are going to interact with the seller in some way as a culture investigator for you. And in that way, you'll build a picture of the culture that's based on a lot of different data points, instead of just based on HR's perception of the organization that they're buying, or just a bit based on our interactions with the leadership team. So I think you do that by educating the due diligence team. I advocate finding some sort of a culture model, and there's just dozens and dozens of models out there that you can look at, and helping the members of the due diligence team understand the dimensions of culture that you're going to talk about, and just giving them common language or a common lens for them to look at culture during due diligence. So yeah, you can't start too soon. You can, I also should have said you can start pre-due diligence too by looking at online resources. The company website can give a clue about culture. Do they talk about employees on the website, or are employees not an important part of the image that they're trying to present. How about Glassdoor? What does Glassdoor say about the culture? What does Glassdoor say about the CEO? So there's lots of ways that you can start to build a really rounded out picture of the business you're buying.
Great, thanks, Rob. Maureen, how about you? What are your thoughts on when we should start discussing culture and some of the trends that you're seeing?
I would completely agree with Rob in terms of the early piece. You know, for sure, the earlier the better. And I would say that when you're pre-signing, some of the most significant risks that, you know, I think you do start to see pretty early on should be discussed, and confirming mitigation plans, at least at a high level, before you actually get to signing a deal. I have one that comes to mind around attrition rates. So one of the things we learned early on was that this company had pretty high attrition rates, which is not unusual for some startup tech companies. But when we dug a little bit deeper, they actually had really high involuntary attrition. So they were hiring people and then managing them out very quickly, which was a kind of a strange trend for us to see. And so then we had to peel back the layers on that and say, well, gosh, this could certainly be an issue in stabilizing, you know, the business and the team, especially in those early months. And could this be what is it pointing back to? One of the things we thought it probably was around hiring, right? So talent selection processes, and is that going too fast, and, you know, how is that being handled? And again, kind of what are the values underneath all of that that's causing that situation? So again, going into deal signing, when we're thinking about the integration and delivering the value that we're signing up for, we were able to talk about it as a team, you know, not just, this is not an HR problem, this is kind of how is the business going to look at this and help support the company and the employees and the hiring managers coming in. And I think, again, I think it was the earlier session where the comment of change management shouldn't be a separate thing. It should be embedded and infused in everything that you're doing. And culture is certainly that same thing, right? So I think that the early conversation and being able to identify what you can early on, try to get the really, you know, big risk areas and talk about mitigation so that when you're signing, you kind of know what you're getting into. I think the other piece, the only other piece I would comment on here is the early and often concept. So in starting those discussions early and having a framework that everybody who's working on diligence is looking at a simple structure around culture that makes it easy to think about what they can be observing and peeling back the layers on. And then to not have it as a separate conversation or debrief, but every time the team's coming together, we just ask the question, is anybody seeing operational risks around any of these areas? And if this framework is simple and you can get the buy-in from the team to look at those operating areas, then in every discussion, you're observing and debriefing. And in that way, I think it just makes it easier then to do that, you know, how you embed it and how you integrate it moving forward.
Great, thanks, Maureen. Mark, how about you? What are your thoughts?
A couple thoughts. One is I see cultural due diligence really beginning after a letter of intent. And now why I say that is because the scope of due diligence is should reflect the cultural aspects before due diligence begins. And a lot of that, I believe, depends on deal type and culture overlap. So for example, if the deal strategy is it'll be a standalone company, maybe the CFO and the CEO will have the most overlap with the acquirer. Well, the cultural impact may be very low. Might also be very low if the acquirer is looking to sell the entity, again, keep it separately and sell the entity in a short period of time. And that's kind of goes to the, doesn't matter so much what it is, it's not going to, you know, pollute the gene pool elsewhere. And it's something that isn't going to be a long-term thing we have to deal with. So I think that's where it's important. If in a full integration, that's where understanding the acquirer and the target company is really going to be important. Similarly, if a prior standalone company is now going to become part of a platform, and I'm seeing that a lot more lately, where the smaller company is being purchased, but the acquirer is also building out a platform company and then essentially integrating these smaller organizations into it. So an emerging component that I see is ESG related due diligence, so environmental, social, and governance. And it's certainly something that in the investment community, even down to IRA investments, there's a lot of ESG implications. And from a government perspective, we saw last year the SEC requiring reporting of HR indicators. So what's that mean from a due diligence perspective? Well, when I think of social side of it in human capital, I think about organizational culture. I think about the employee experience and well-being, also rewards. And that's one of those places for me where culture goes from the aspirations to what is actually rewarded, team comp, individual comp, what's the mix, what's the range. So, and then the operational excellence from HR, which I would look at, I believe, or is being looked at, I should say, from a talent management perspective, from recruiting, onboarding, training and development, and separations. On governance, also seeing succession planning and board and executive compensation being considerations there. And that again, in addition to DEI, is again, I think some of those emerging areas for due diligence that are just going to become more and more important. And I think it's important for us as deal people in the broader category to really look at how our scope of due diligence and perhaps be an advocate as well in taking a look at some of these areas up front.
Great, thanks, Mark. How about you, Susan?
Yeah, thanks. Wow, that was a lot, Mark. I'm going to start off back when you first started with ESG, because thanks for bringing up diversity and what's happening from an investor perspective of how investors now are looking at ESGs now. And I have seen in the marketplace in the last 2 years an increase of, if you would say, chief diversity or diversity roles. And as we've seen those roles increase in the last 2 years, those new roles emerging, I'm also seeing a blend of chief talent officers and chief diversity officers, those roles blending together, that they have to align with the business goals. So as you talk about the new requirements, the SEC filing of having to companies show their HCM or their human capital management data on that ESG, is what data are they going to share? So this next year will be very interesting, because as you're doing that due diligence and as you are looking at companies, what are they going to uncover? What's the story they're going to tell about their culture? And where's the progress going? So as you look from progress of year 1 to year 2, are they moving the needle? Are they growing? How are they impacting the communities? And that is definitely, I have seen an increase in organizations really working on that. If they're mature, then they actually are going into a deeper level, into intersectionality, into other demographic data. That's going to tell even more of a story about the culture and where things are trending. So glad you brought that up. I know y'all were talking about sort of early on in due diligence. I'm going to take us to after the deal is signed. And a trend that I'm seeing right now, and a lot of this diversity consulting I've been doing, is seeing companies really grow and create these groups called BRGs, business resource groups. They may call them different things, but in the last couple of years, I've seen companies really want to listen to their employees, and they've created groups, communities, ways to connect, be heard, that may be called things like culture committees, lean-in groups, focus groups, employee resource groups, BRGs. But where they are very valuable to an organization right now is, especially in this sort of great resignation, great shuffle that I'm now hearing, is how quickly you can onboard those new hires or those acquirees now. So those new employees that you're going to have, those new hires, onboarding is now coming, I think, front and center. And one of the ways you can leverage your BRGs or to activate them, as I hear that verb now, let's activate our BRGs, is to really help them, because that is a great group of networks. And for ADP, we've got 9 of them. We're, I would say on a maturity scale, very mature. And we're using them on 2 different levels. One, to activate, to help with our talent recruiting strategies. Because right now, sourcing talent is absolutely critical and retaining talent. The second one is, from a culture perspective, is onboarding. And as we're in this virtual group, virtual world, is how do you build this sense of inclusion and connectivity, if you will, connections. Mm-hmm. And those BRGs, we have a mentoring program with our BRGs where we match mentees up with these new hires. And I hear this over and over again, that how important this is. But what we've done is we've actually automated the process. So we have this mentor-mentee app where we, remember the old days when you have to do an Excel spreadsheet and go back and pair everybody up, and it was, oh my goodness. But, this is like a dating app now. This is like, speed dating for mentor-mentee. Love it. And you uses your LinkedIn profile and you find each other. But the BRGs are key to that. And that would just be one of the trends that I'm seeing I think this is absolutely very important for companies to leverage these groups. Why not? People are looking for a way to belong right now, and why not pair them up? So I've seen that happen as a trend. So love to hear your comments. Please share them with us.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Elizabeth, how about you?
Sure, a lot of great content already. I'll try to be quick with just a point or two. One, and so far as the timing, I would say even pre-due diligence, right? So the acquiring organization ideally has a common baseline understanding of what their culture is, as well as what the key aspects are of their culture that are going to be key to enabling that particular deal. So you're starting due diligence with that framework already established. In terms of trends, agree. I was going to mention the sort of the growth and importance of DEI, as well as flexible work environment. And with more focus on both of these areas, it's also coming into play earlier in a more integrated fashion in due diligence, as well as integration. And the quick example I'll give is an integration I was recently working with, and in the planning phase of defining the work streams to look at, we decided to have a dedicated work stream for DEI. It was so important to them. And then having that focus gives a spotlight to the organization, as well as gives it some power behind it to then more actively integrate the DEI objectives into other work that was going on, whether that is defining new rewards, of course, culture, and things of that nature. And I think finally on a trend potentially is, I think we're going to start to see more instances of deals being turned away because of a significant misalignment in culture.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So just to summarize, and again, some great information here. So cultural assessment has to start before you sign the deal. It can start during the target screening phase using resources like the company website and Glassdoor. And again, having a view on your own firm's culture and values is critical to understanding the differences. If you start thinking about culture when you're ready to announce, your employee comms plans are likely to fall flat. And it's about minimizing disruption and ensuring business continuity. So you want to ensure that your communications are effective. We need to make sure acquired employees feel like part of the company, part of the team, to retain them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that again in the next section. But to Susan's point, connection and belonging are important, especially during the Great Resignation. I think it was Mark who said the level of diligence should reflect the cultural impact of your integration model. HR is often responsible for cultural assessment, and several of our panelists brought this up, but the entire diligence team should be looking for cultural clues using a common framework. And it should be part of the deal work stream, not just part of HR's work stream. We talked quite a bit about environmental, social, and governance initiatives becoming more critical for employees. And to Elizabeth's point, those companies where there's a significant mismatch in the ESG and other cultural areas might see deals not happening. It includes several items, including DEI, succession planning, talent management, and we pointed to the new SEC requirements, and I'll also throw in there's a new ISO standard, well, new, it was 2018, on human capital reporting, and both those SEC and the ISO standards can help provide a framework. And then finally, I think it was Maureens who said culture is a way at getting at operational risks, since culture is about how things get done. Like I said, I started my career in M&A before we really started talking about culture. And Maureens, I think I might have stolen this from you since we've known each other and for so long. But there was a long time where I wasn't referring to cultural risks. I was calling it operational readiness or pointing to operational risks. So business leaders who thought culture was a soft, fluffy thing would take me seriously. So thanks for giving so much information, team. So we've talked a lot about culture and why it matters. What are some practical ways for companies to take action on the cultural assessments that they've done? Mark, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to jump off a topic we just spoke about with work stream and project team. So I think most of us would agree that culture is caught rather than taught, meaning people are going to observe it from their leader, from each other, and how the work gets done. So where I see a practical way for companies to take action is actually how they staff the work stream teams and the IMO, the Integration Management Office, Project Management Office, because it's so visible and it's an opportunity just by demonstrating it to communicate, to build capabilities around change leadership, and maybe to get people involved who are not part of the normal stream. So let me define what I mean by that. So some of a recent project that I completed, and actually one I'm on right now that's a digital transformation, we're using the middle managers as our key communication method because there's a tremendous impact on the shop floor. So this is a manufacturing example, just as true in digital transformation as it is in M&A. They're the key to the deal: adoption, proficiency, and utilization. So that's where the middle managers, and we say a middle manager in this context is managers and supervisors, the front line. It's also informal influencers, the people that those shop floor employees are going to go to and say, hey, Mary, hey, John, what do you think of this? Are you concerned? What do you think this impact is going to be on us? So just in a micro sense, but I think a broad impact is demonstrate the culture, the to-be culture, by how you staff the work streams, how you train people up, and then how you communicate. I think they're all the ways that the target culture is demonstrated rather than just described.
Great, thanks, Mark. Susan, how about you? Additional thoughts on some practical ways for companies to take action on their cultural assessment, their cultural findings?
The biggest thing I'm seeing right now is just the role of HR. And I know several of you on the panel, when we were preparing, we're talking just really about how each of your companies have done research lately about hybrid workplace, HR's touch points, and culture overall, and what are the different ways for measuring it. And I know we just did a study that came out that talked about how important HR's touch points are when it comes to affecting the culture. Those touch points and retaining talent is absolutely critical. So the more touch points you have, the more engaged that employee will be, or that associate will, which will reduce turnover. So I think that that's critical. And I think it's an interesting blend too, from a technology discussion too, from culture, is we're trying to automate so many things. And so when is it actually right to have a touch point with a person? Then we have AI and chatbots happening. And from a culture perspective, we also have we're tight on resources from a standpoint of some companies are very lean right now. So they are spread. And so what does that do from span of control of what is that role of the HR business partner? And from a retention perspective, from a deal cycle, I just, as I'm looking at it going, wow, we're already getting torn. We have some HR roles that are getting hard to fill right now. It's getting harder and harder to find certain positions. And as you look to automate, how do you really make those touch points you have? And that, do you actually know who your HR person is at a company, who that person is, and can you go to them? And what's that turnaround time? I think that is really just a really good question. Is we're looking at so many things HR is facing and the future of what HR looks like. So that was just a thought I threw out there, but there's definitely some good research that just show how important that HR role is and them touching and connecting with that employee right now from a job switcher market that we're in.
And Susan, I think you had just recently shared some ADP research on the touch points with HR really making a difference in culture.
Yeah, basically some of the research said that three things that came out of this, really driving the people of the cultural experience, is a single point of contact. So having a single point of contact really increases retention and engagement. The number of interactions matter. The more connection you have, the better. And how important that connection is when it comes to onboarding. So those were really, and that the humans or employees want to know their HR leader. They want people or someone to know them. So especially now in this virtual world. And then the last piece was just the role of how it drives your talent brand too. All this is important back to your branding. And some organizations I'm working with, when they go through acquisitions, they're not brand known. So if they're not recognizable, all these internal levers like this about retaining your talent because you don't have the name recognition are really going to play a key role. So this is just a few data points around what I'm seeing, Clint, and some of the research.
Great, thanks, Susan. Elizabeth, how about your thoughts?
Sure, thanks. So the question on some practical ways, in some regards, assessing culture is the easier part. I'm sure many people here have a deck somewhere that lays out very eloquently what their culture is or the differences. But it may have just sat there, right, as a deck, because many times our implementation and change programs sort of suffer from a failure to finish. And in this case, what we see frequently is because the change program around cultural alignment, it's too big, it's too complex, it's trying to boil the ocean. And, getting down to sort of the nuts and bolts of being practical is what we found to be successful, is really focusing on, a fewer key aspects and focusing on those that are really tied to deal value. Because this is where we are in the enterprise strategy at this moment. And looking at it in terms of, for example, 90-day sprints. So define one or two things that are going to impact deal value, lay out a plan for 90 days, implement some changes, and then at the end of those 90 days, make those measurable outcomes visible to the organization so they can see the success. Yes, we changed something. Here's why we were successful in doing it. Here's what it looks like now. And now we're going to tackle the next 90 days and the next one or two items. The only other comment I would make on this is it's also important to recognize that you may not have a common culture across the target organization due to legacy organizations not having been fully integrated. And so any of these 90-day sprints or implementation alignment plans are going to need to be tailored a bit for different parts of the organization. It's just another thing to take into consideration.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Rob, how about you?
I really like the idea of using any culture assessment work you've done during due diligence and in the lead up to the signing as a springboard into a conversation that you can facilitate between the leadership team at the acquirer and the leadership team at the seller. I think, there's a lot of power in sort of saying, this is what we learned or what we think we learned about your organization and its culture, and let the acquired leaders tell you, where they think you got it right and where they think maybe it's a little different than what you believe you've discovered. But it's also then an opportunity for the seller to say, here are some similarities and differences between the cultures in our organization and some of what you might experience as you join us. And then, and this is the most important part, to have a collaborative discussion about how you chart the future together and how you're going to steer the acquired population and help them acclimate as comfortably as possible to their new cultural environment. And there'll be all different kind of shades of gray in terms of how how integrated or not integrated they are into the culture, because there usually are lots of flavors of culture in large organizations. But I think it's a great way to establish a meaningful dialogue with acquired leaders. Obviously, I mean, another action you take is just in the way you plan out your communication. Do you wear a suit to day one, or do you need to wear jeans on day one? All things like that will make you seem more relevant to the population that you've acquired.
Great, thanks, Rob. And Maureen, how about you?
Sure. So, gosh, there's so many great ideas and perspectives shared. I feel like I could go in a couple of different directions. I think I'd reinforce, and it's what Rob started with about that springboard, right? That what you've done in the due diligence piece of this, that should be what you're springboarding off of, as Rob put it, right, into integration planning. And in that same way, I would say kind of that simple framework and in the integration planning with both teams, right? So both the acquiring company and the target company jointly planning around integration activities with that framework about calling out what we're trying to care for and support for the employee experience and then the operations of the business. Another piece that I would say is it's the research that Susan was talking about is so interesting. And I think in addition to the HR touch points, the whole idea of attention equals retention, right? So the more attention that employees are getting, certainly from HR and also from people leaders themselves, right? So the direct managers that the employees are rolling up into. And so part of what we tried to do in kind of navigating culture risks and mitigating that throughout the integration is putting that hyper focus on the people leaders from the acquisition and then from, again, our own company and leaders that are bringing these teams in. And if we can support the leaders in what they're navigating, then they can support their employees and putting like a hyper focus on that. And then I will tie that back to what Elizabeth was saying in that it does need to be manageable, because this can feel like the old days of like this massive spreadsheet of, these are all the things that we're considering, and that can be overwhelming. So I think the idea of really getting a handle on the most significant areas that where we need to focus to mitigate the risk, to deliver the value, and just revisiting that in discussion. Doesn't have to be a binder on the shelf that somebody talked about, I think, in the earlier session, or these spreadsheets, or really the discussion and having that early and having that often.
Great, thanks, Maureen. So to summarize, the pre-culture work, or the culture work done in diligence rather, can be a springboard for a conversation between the leadership teams on both the buy and sell side. And transparency with the acquired leadership team can help them allow them to help shape the plan and helps make them feel like part of the broader team. Elizabeth talked about how there's often a failure to finish because it's a big plan, and recommends breaking it down into chunks, 90-day sprints, where you do the work, you show the success, and then you communicate that to employees and go on to the next 90 days. Mark talked about staffing the IMO and the PMI work streams. I will emphasize that we do call them work streams because you do have to have work, which requires bodies. It doesn't just magically happen. And then several of our panelists talked to the need for high quality relationships at work. I think Maureens said attention drives retention. So don't forget about the people leaders, especially the middle managers, and ensure HR is staffed for the work. If you want to keep people around, we need high touch and strong relationships. So I want to turn to a couple of the questions about that we have in the chat. One of the questions is, what happens when the selling company has what the person asking the question calls a much more sophisticated, inclusive, collaborative culture than the acquirer, and employees might feel like they're taking a step back. I will say that this dynamic I've seen happen on both sides. It's not just moving from collaboration to top down, but I've seen people struggle moving from a top down culture to one where everybody is involved in decision making. So taking the judgment piece out of which culture is better, let's talk about how we help employees bridge the gap when there are significant cultural differences. And why don't we start with Mark, and then I'll turn it over to Rob and Maureen, and then we've got one other question. So please, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Clint. So I'm going to link a few things together with one recent example. So this was an example where the acquired company was very entrepreneurial. The target company was very R&D orientated in terms of their culture. And I think this is one of the points that's really important is the acquired company and the target realized they were different. And part of the deal thesis was, if we learn from each other and if we combine this entrepreneurial, we've got to sell this stuff, and R&D, it has to have the right quality or it's not going to be sustainable. They recognize that up front. And I guess I don't know if I would have done this parallel before the call, but maybe I'm just a little smarter now. It comes to inclusion and diversity. They're different, but they recognized, we can go much farther together. So one of the activators for that was a leadership summit. And one of these companies was based in New York, the entrepreneurial company. The other was in a Nordic country. So they met in the Nordic country for a couple of days. This is a leadership team, and they went very far down. And we did a survey in advance and also put in a little education piece on culture, not only geographical culture, but also R&D culture and entrepreneurial culture, just so there's an understanding of what's different and get people excited, frankly, about the opportunity, because they both realized that they had a limitation. So the leadership summit was very important to that. And I would say in the opposite situation, maybe the acquirer doesn't really see the differences. This is another value of culture due diligence. And then they have a choice. Again, is it something where the goal is to find the right blend based on the deal objectives? Or, is it going to be a cram down? And I guess if it's a cram down, then that's where the key player turnover is really the risk. And Maureen, I always learn something when I'm on a panel with you. Attention equals retention. Way to go. I love that.
I wish I could give credit to whoever I heard that from. But,
Could we qualify that with just good attention? No.
you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I was tossing to Rob. Rob, how about you? What are your thoughts on cultural mismatch?
I was going to start talking. I thought you were sending it over to me, but my thought builds on what Mark had to say. We miss an opportunity to really evolve our own organization, if we're, and I'm assuming we're the acquirer, if we're not looking at the cultures that we're buying and saying, what could we learn from these people? So in my last position, I worked for a very, very mature organization, that grappled with being nimble and being innovative. And, in the course of doing all of the deals that we did as an organization, we encountered or purchased young, vibrant, very different kinds of culture from our own. And we had a lot of discussions about, how can we, sometimes somebody would call it reverse integrate. But it's really about emulating another culture or figuring out ways to adopt aspects of that culture. And I think, you can do that by moving acquired leaders into leadership positions that will have an impact on bigger parts of the organization. So I think that's just my challenge to HR people. Don't assume that your current culture is the way that it needs to or should be going forward. You really can help your organization by helping them see the future.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Why don't we switch to one last question? I think we only have time to pull one panelist in to answer that. So Maureen, can you tell us how important leaders are to a successful cultural integration? How important are they really?
I'd say they're critical, right? I mean, a few thoughts come to mind. The whole idea of if you think about change management and change agents, right? And it's identifying those people who are like the influencers and the folks that are at the leader levels who we know employees are looking up to. And that's both at the target company, right? That they're working for today, but certainly in the company that they're joining, it's like that trust and belief in the vision and how employees feel a part of that, I think is really, really important. And then I think the other piece is part of what I was saying earlier, that individual people managers, especially like the direct report into leaders, we've seen that at Cisco as being critically important, just in general for employee engagement, but certainly when acquired teams are coming in and there's so much going on, they need to be supported and enabled and given information and actionable ways to interact with the teams. And so we used to have something called leadership expectations, which sounds kind of very old school HR. I think we're finding something better, and I think it's something like leadership commitments now, which is, if you are committing to being a people leader, that attention part is a big part of it. You have to dedicate the time with the team, be having the conversation. So again, the flow of that from an integration perspective is we have an obligation as an integration team to help message and make easier for people leaders to do the work that they're doing. And then those people leaders need to be working with their teams, both their direct reports and the teams that they lead. But yeah, to summarize, I would just say to that question, critically important to the integration success.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Maureen, for sharing that. I think that we have hit time. So a big thank you to everybody who participated in the panel for the great questions that came through. Elizabeth, Mark, Rob, Maureen, Susan, thank you for being such great leaders in this space and for sharing what we know will help acquisitions go better. The cultural alignment piece, it really does drive value. And a big thank you to Mergerware for making the cultural piece such an important part of this summit.
Very engaging panel discussions. Thanks, Clay, for moderating the panel. I would also like to thank our panelists, Susan, Mark, Maureen, Rob, and Elizabeth for this wonderful discussion. We would now have a short 10 minutes break and we would get back at 10:30 a.m. CDT for our third and the last round of panel discussion on the topic, M&A and digitalization. Thank you.